So,
Thank you. Well, yes, thank you everyone for coming and welcome. Yes, as Antti has introduced me, I live in Turku now, where I organize, well, it's things similar to what's happening right now, where I just talk about something about Belarus, and then we write some postcards and letters of solidarity, and also try to raise some funds by baking some vegan stuff every month. And I didn't really know what audience I would have today, so I hope that you know as little as possible because I prepared some quite general stuff that I put into 5 different questions, and those 5 different questions are related to the past, in a way, historical context, and the present of the country. And we can start with the first question, which is, has Belarus always been this close to Russia? Because, well, I think quite many people know that the current Belarusian regime is quite close to the Putinist regime, and Lukashenko, who is the kind of illegitimate president of the Belarusian Republic of Belarus right now, he is very pro-Russian, and there might be quite a logical question. What's the reason behind Belarus being so close in its political affiliation to Russia? And the answer to the question, whether it's always been like that, is no. And actually, Belarus has been very tightly connected to Lithuania for most of its times. And from the 12th to 14th century, the Belarusian state, or this lands where the current Belarusian state is, were together with the Lithuanian lands, and after some quite a short period of time, in around the 13th century, also quite a big part of Ukrainian lands was together with the current lands of Belarus and Lithuania. And the state of this duchy, which is called the Great Duchy of Lithuania, as you can see, was quite often at war with the Muscovy, or the lands of current Moscow, and like Pskov and Tver and some other regions of Russia. And this continued, well, quite for a long time of the existence of the state. After one of the wars, which was quite severe, the Great Duchy of Lithuania joined with the Polish lands, with the Polish kingdom, kingdom, yes, it was kingdom. And they formed kind of a joint commonwealth of Lithuania and Poland. And also, for this reason, quite often, if you see in the English language literature, or in maybe some other foreign language literature, the reference to Poland, and if it regards the 17th or 18th century, it also means, well, Lithuania and Belarus, because this whole commonwealth is also quite often referred to as just Poland. Or for example, if we go back to the Great Duchy of Lithuania, this is also quite often referred to just Lithuania, even though the territory it included was quite bigger. Then there were much more wars with Russia, and after them, and also after quite a big series of wars with Sweden, because Sweden was gaining power, this whole Commonwealth lost in a way its importance or its strength. And at the end of the 18th century, 3 empires, namely Austrian Empire, Prussian Empire, and the Russian Empire, technically annexed 3 parts of this Commonwealth. And what happened was that the whole territory of Belarus, together with around half of the half of Ukrainian lands, were annexed to Russian Empire. Quite a big part of the Ukrainian lands, technically all Western Ukraine, joined Austria, and part of Poland went to Austria, and the bigger part of Poland went to Prussian Empire. And during those times, what was happening in the Belarusian lands, because we were talking about those, was that the Russian Empire just technically aimed to silence and to oppress any kind of national movement that was gaining that was happening in Belarus, because, well, people were not really pleased just with being annexed to a different state, and there were a series of different uprisings, different in a way wars as well, and all of it just resulted in the Russian Empire, for example, closing some universities in those lands, in the current lands of Belarus and Lithuania, also banning technically the names of Lithuanian and Belarusian, and also in a way banning the use of Belarusian language in some of the Russian universities, because when the universities in these lands were banned, well, people started just going to the St. Petersburg, for example, to study, because, well, this was the closest university at that time, and people used still their own language, and this was not really this did not really make people happy in the Russian Empire. But what happened later, we'll just flash forward quite for a century, was the World War I, and during that time, quite many states were gaining their independences, and Belarus was one of them as well. And the states were just kind of using this whole, in a way, moment of uncertainty and the moment of weakness between the greater powers or the empires that were on the verge of ceasing to be. And Belarus proclaimed its independence on the 25th March of 1918. And this day is now celebrated also as the Independence Day among the Belarusian opposition, and also in a way the Day of Freedom, because, well, people for some reason also started to associate with day with freedom, and that was quite promising. But then happened Soviet army, and they technically, what they did was just they came to the Belarusian People's Republic, which was self-proclaimed at that time, and well, technically just, well, grasped the whole power and announced the Soviet power on those lands, and the Belarusian Soviet Socialistic Republic was announced, which also became a part of the Union of Soviet Socialistic Republics. And what was happening during those times was technically something similar to what was happening in the Russian Empire, but also in a way at a more gruesome level, because if before in the Russian Empire things were just being banned, in the Soviet state, especially in the 1930s, people who were trying to raise the national movement, or people who were connected to some sort of academian spheres or the intellectual spheres, or, for example, writers, poets, maybe some academicians, well, some of them were just killed. So that was what was happening. And technically, the whole Belarusian, in a way, self-identity was not really developing. And I think people were just existing in those times of the USSR. But later, I would say, starting with 1980s, after this, in a way, weakening of the USSR, and, well, not weakening of the USSR per se, but weakening of the, I would say, Soviet power in the USSR, and the weakening of the connections between the different republics in the state. The Belarusian Republic also started to getting kind of returning to its roots, and people started to protest against the USSR itself, against the power in the country. So people were not really satisfied with just being the part of this whole Soviet Union, and this was partly the reason why the Belarusian Republic gained its independence again in 1991 when the USSR fell apart. And for the first 3-4 years, it was quite promising as well. And the Belarusian language, for example, was the only official language of the country at that time during those 3 years of independence at the beginning. And quite many symbols that were used, for example, the national coat of arms, was also referring to the national coat of arms of the Great Duchy of Lithuania. And here you can see the coat of arms of the Belarusian Republic at that time, and also the coat of arms of the Lithuanian Republic at that time. So technically, two states had almost identical coats of arms for some period of time. But then what happened was Lukashenko, and even though in the beginning, during his first election, he was probably chosen legitimately, and he gained his presidential seat by actually gaining the majority of votes. What was happening later was just him strengthening his power, and also bringing Belarus back as close as possible to the Russian Federation. And one of those moments was the agreement of the closer integration between the two states. And people, as you can see in the pictures, were not always that happy with that. And this is technically what's been happening for the last 25 years, was just the regime of the Lukashenko just in a way tightening or sewing the Republic of Belarus close to the Russian Federation. And even though I would say me personally and a lot of people in the country don't have any issues with Russia or with people in the country, just in a way this whole trying to be the integrated part of this commonwealth of the two countries, this is what's raising a lot of questions in me personally and also in other people. And I think I should make a remark that this whole presentation is going to be quite subjective. So if you have a different opinion, you can always sound that and tell me that you don't agree with me. And and also this is also the part of the reason that there's being this kind of notion of three sisters of Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus, which is, I would say, detrimental to these countries, all of them, not just Belarus and Russia, but to Russia, not Belarus and Ukraine, but to Russia as well, because all three countries have had quite different ways in their histories, and all three countries have had different pathways. But so the short answer to the first question is no. The second question, so what language do actually people speak in the country? And there is the Russian language, and in this scheme you can see the Balto-Slavic superfamily, I think, or family of the Indo-European languages, and there are Russian, Belarusian, Russian, and Ukrainian languages. And as you can see in the scheme, Belarusian language, well, it's also marked as Belarusian, but never mind. It's closest to Ukrainian, because both these languages come from this, in a way, called the language that was called Old Ruthenian or Ruthenian or something, and they branched out more recently compared to Russian. So Russian kind of branched out from all these Slavic languages quite earlier in the history. And there is a separate language. Here is what the alphabet looks like. It doesn't really differ much from Ukrainian or Russian, but there are some peculiarities, like this weird letter with the I don't know what kind of arch above it or something. And we also have the whole Latin alphabet, because I guess some people who don't really know any of the Cyrillic languages, the Cyrillic alphabet does not tell you anything. But since the state, or like the lands of Belarus, well, we're often at the crossroads of different cultures in a way, because, well, it's in a way borderline between like Eastern Slavic countries and Western Slavic countries. We have had a tradition as well of Latin alphabet, and it was not just something that's used to transcribe different, for example, names or geographical names, but it was actually something that was used to write things in. So, for example, if we look at one of the publishing houses in 1914, out of 80 publishings, there were 44 in Cyrillic alphabet, 20 in Latin alphabet, and 16 in both. And some of the most significant Belarusian works in literature will also create in the Latin alphabet, actually. And just now, when people study them in the country, they study them in the Cyrillic alphabet. Another surprise is that Belarus actually has the Arabic alphabet as well, and this is the reason for that is that some of the Tatars that came to the Belarusian lands in, for example, 15th, 16th century, and some of them came voluntarily, but some of them were, what's the word? War something. Yeah, war prisoners of war. Yeah. They eventually forgot the Arab language, but they continued using their kitabs and other writings of other Muslim writings and works, but they started writing them not in the Arab language, but in the Belarusian language, but they still continued using the Arab alphabet. So that's something peculiar about the language, because not so many languages can be in a way proud of having 3 different graphic systems. But what's important, and what's important to understand what language people actually speak in the country right now, is that when the Russian Empire came to Belarusian lands, the language was just banned. But when the Soviet power came, as I mentioned before, people who were in a way responsible for maintaining the language and in a way protecting it from the influence of the Russian language, there were quite many of them killed. Some of them were sent into exile. And for example, if you look at the picture in the slide, out of the 12 members of the Literature Association, 8 were killed, 2 were sent into exile, and 2 in the bottom were kind of remained alive, and they continued writing their works, but at the same time they needed to be constantly writing some letters of apologetic letters of their activities, and they were also quite often scrutinized by the Soviet power. So what happened after that was that technically the Belarusian language and Belarusian culture lost people who could continue producing something in this language, or could continue in a way fighting for its historical ancestry, and the language became very easily and very quickly susceptible to the Russification. And I think in maybe 1950s, one of the grammar textbooks that was released, it had quite many changes in the language that brought the language closer to the Russian language, actually. And Belarus is not the sole, in a way, victim, or the only country that had this episode. Ukraine had the same, and I think the other republics that were joined to the USSR also had this kind of similar happening. For example, the Baltic countries, and also the countries in the Central Asia, like Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and others. And what resulted from this was that in 2009, only half of the people considered the Belarusian language as their mother tongue. And if people were asked about what language they actually use most commonly at home, only 23% of people answered that it was the Belarusian language. And which is interesting is that in 1999, still around 3/4 of people considered Belarusian as their mother tongue. So it was not really too bad in the independence times of Belarus, but also then the regime of Lukashenko also made its part in more people in Belarus using Russian rather than Belarusian. And also another thing which is important is that if you look at the map, then all the urban areas, for example, the whole Minsk, the capital, and the regional capitals, they are grayish. Do you see this? No. Okay, whatever. The urban areas are gray, so less people use Belarusian in the urban areas, and the whole language, in a way, I would say, stigmatized, or it used to be stigmatized in 2010s as the countryside language. And quite many people who moved from the countryside to the cities started switching to Russian just because, well, they didn't want to look some, I don't know, rednecks or someone who just moved from the countryside and couldn't speak the proper language, which is Russian considered to be. So yeah, there's that. And thanks to Lukashenko regime again, because now after 2020, I would say that there is another uprisal of the language, and quite many people switch to that, and becomes more popular with the youth actually. And quite many people start to create content, and they start to just write in it themselves. Many people switched to it. I myself switched completely to Belarusian in 2022, I think. Yeah, 22. Because before I would just speak it with the friends who spoke Belarusian before, but with the majority I would speak Russian. But yeah, that's happening at the grassroots level. But what's happening at the state level in the country is that, well, everything's being brought more to the Russian tradition, Russian language. And for example, if we look at such things as the underground, the metro, or some road signs, for example, they had before they had the Latin transcription, so that actually people who don't know Cyrillic alphabet would be somewhat able to read it, because it's I would say in the tradition with the Western Slavic languages. For example, the C letter is pronounced as T, like T sound, and some others. But last year the metro signs were changed in a way that there is Belarusian language now, and they're dubbed in just Russian. So technically, if you don't know the Cyrillic alphabet, you have no chance of understanding what's happening in the metro anymore. And in the road signs, the same thing is happening. Anything that might be considered something more Western is just wiped out from the existence in the country, and it gets to the ridiculous examples sometimes. Because, for example, there is a Polish city called Belastok, or Belastok, I think, Białystok, because in Polish it's Białystok, and then it doesn't really make any sense to have it just in the Cyrillic alphabet, because it's not in the country even. It's in Poland. So if people who are just traveling to another country want to get to the city in that another country, they also cannot do that, because, well, it's only dubbed in the Cyrillic alphabet. So the short answer to the second question is that most people speak Russian, but the Belarusian language is on the high now, but only at the level of people, but the state tries to oppress it. The third question: what's the ethnonym for Belarus? And the ethnonym is the adjective that refers to the people or the language of the land. And this part of the lecture is going to be the shortest, I think. And well, it's Belarusian or Belarusian, and anything that has the sh sound in it, I would say personally is not really the best way to say the adjective, but different people have different opinions. And the reason for that, I will tell you a bit later. And here we can see the example from the Cambridge Dictionary, and this is, I would say, quite good, because it has the proper, so to speak, way as the first option, and then just a bunch of different versions that I don't really know how they differ even. But then if you look at the Oxford Dictionary, the online version of the Oxford Dictionary, then it has still like this Belarusian adjective in it. And also, I didn't notice at the beginning, but the disambiguation of the word also says that it's closely related to Russian, even though it's not completely true, because the closest is Ukrainian. So that it would be more correct to say to Ukrainian and Russian, or just Ukrainian than Russian. And the reason why there is actually the word Belarusian, which I think maybe in 2000s or late 1990s was also spelled with the Y at the beginning, is that the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic was spelled in this way. So this is the way how the whole international language tradition adopted the name of the country as well, or the name of the word meaning the language or the people. Because, for example, in the United Nations, for quite a while, the country itself was named Belarusia and not Belarus, for example. And yeah, this is in a way the short reason for that. And then there comes another question. So what should the name of the country be then, if we're just speaking about the republic itself? And well, as you know, different languages have different versions of the name. And for example, even Finnish is Valko-Venäjä. And in quite many other countries, it's still like something that is just quite directly translated as White Russia. And this is wrong from my perspective for several reasons. And one of them being that technically it confuses two different states, because if we have two states that have the same what's the word, stem in their names, it just leads to the confusion. Because I had an occasion in 2019 when I was on exchange in Finland, when I was actually asked, isn't Belarus part of Russia? So that's one of the reasons. And another reason is that the usage of like Russia stem instead of the Rus stem in the name of the country also confuses the Russian state or Russia with the state that existed in the history, which existed in like 10th, 11th century, which was called Rus or Ruthenia. And the name of Belarus comes from specifically that name. So like the original name of the country in the Belarusian language or in the Russian language is Belarus, which comes from this Rus. And Russia also comes from Rus, but it's a different name now. So this is another reason, which I explained, probably it's way too complicated, to use just Belarus or the name that says Belarus in the language. And some of the countries have actually switched to that. For example, in Swedish, Norwegian, and German, people are actually using either officially or in the major media, they're using Belarus instead of Vitrusland and something else that I cannot really pronounce correctly, well, except Weißrussland. But predominantly, it's still named as just White Russia in the countries. So the short answer to the third question, that the ethnonym is Belarusian, and I would prefer people saying Belarus instead of any other option. But of course, everyone has their own arguments, and everyone has the right to choose what they want to. And especially since the official versions are still these ones. The fourth question: did the human rights and political situation become bad only after 2020? And the short answer is no, because starting from the time that Lukashenko came to power, people started to be quite opposed to it, and people started to publicly express their opinions, and that was always followed by detentions, arrests, and arrests for several years of the most significant people. So, for example, in 1996, there was a referendum for the change of the constitution that allowed Lukashenko to be re-elected in sooner time, and also to increase his strength and to have longer term of the presidentship, as far as I remember. And people were opposed to that, and there was a protest, and around 600 people, as far as I remember, were detained at that time. In 1999 and 2000, 4 people just vanished, and it's still not known what happened to them. And one of them was a journalist, 3 other Minister of Internal Affairs, and 2 others were some politicians who were deemed to be the most significant figures of the opposition movement in the country. And people who are relatives of those people, they think that the whole thing has to do with the Lukashenko regime. And also there exists a report of 2001, I think, from people who belongs to the internal affairs structure of the country, who reported the existence of these so-called death squads whose objective is to do these things, kidnap people and organize some murders as well. So there are also protests after each presidential election, starting from 2001. So, for example, in 2001 and 2006, 2010, there were protests after the election, and there were different amounts of people, and the protests were happening even in mid-December. And for example, in 2010, people went to the streets on the 17th of December in winter and still protested, and people were also detained. I think 20 people were sentenced to the terms of 3 to 6 years, especially the candidates that participated in the election. It just continued going on. In 2017, for example, there was a law. Lukashenko signed the law or initiated the law about people who are not employed having to pay taxes, which also doesn't make sense. And people started to protest about that as well. And there were detentions as well. And every time it just was being in the way that there would be protests, there would be political prisoners, and then after that, there would follow some European sanctions. And after that, Lukashenko, in a way, would trade these political prisoners so that the sanctions would be lifted. And every time, cycle of 4 or 5 years, that this would continue. But then, in 2020 happened what happened, and I think everyone knows. The situation is much worse now because, for example, if prior to 2020, there would be around 40 to 50 political prisoners yearly. Now there are around 1,400 to 1,500 now in these years. And this brings us to the last question: how bad is it in Belarus now? Because, it's been almost 4 years since the last election, so maybe it's not even that gruesome anymore. But shortly, it is still very bad. And these are just some news from this week. And for example, one person was sentenced to 5 years of colony for some messages on Telegram, and he was sentenced according to 5 different articles that, you can look at the screen, at the screen. And he was also sentenced to a fine of 2,300 euros when the median salary in the country is around 500 euros. And the median means that not actually the majority of people, not median, average. And this means that not the majority of people actually get it. So it's quite difficult to pay this fine as well. On the 9th of April, one person died in a detention center, and he had heart disease, and he was detained around 1 month and a half prior to that. And this makes him the 6th person who died since 2020 while being imprisoned. And 5 other people died in 2021, and 2 died in 1 died in 2021, 2 died in 2023, and 1 died before in 2024 at the beginning of the year. And what's important is that quite many people in the country who got the sentences are quite old as well, or they have some health conditions, and technically the sentences that they receive are their death sentences as well. Because, for example, if you're 66 years old and you get a sentence of 10 years in the colony, with also it's important, of very low medical care, then you don't really have a big chance of survival through the whole term. And you can see in the slide what who are sentenced and what sentences they actually have. Another piece of news is that on the same day as one person died, two more people were detained. 2 people detained for the protests of 2020, which means that people are still being followed and still being repressed for what happened 4 years ago. 2 people were detained just for doing something with the flag, and another person got convicted while being detained earlier. What happens as well is the repressions towards people who try to receive help. So in this example, we can see there was a scheme of people who are related to political prisoners. So family of political prisoners could apply for financial help to get some food and some just goods of primary need, like, I don't know, some detergents or some clothes or something like that. And it worked quite well, but in January 2024, the platform that was organizing that was deemed extremist. And that meant that everyone who received help via that platform became subject to the article of the Administrative Codex as someone who received financial help from abroad and is connected to some extremist activities. So what happened was that there were at least 100 administrative cases against people who were just receiving some help with food and with other goods from other people. And what people needed to do after they were deemed convicted, was that they gained fines again, and they needed to compensate all of the help that they received, which also is not really easy for them because, well, if they didn't need help, they would have not applied it in the first place. So covering for all that help is quite uneasy for them. If you look at the previous year, we can see that there were at least more than 6,000 cases of political repressions, and more than 4,500 people actually have had some politically motivated administrative cases, which could be fines or some short-term detentions and things like that. And if you look at the political prisoners, so people who were sentenced according to the criminal code, then more than almost 750 people spent their 4th new year in the imprisonment, in the colonies or prisons. So it's not really good still. And according to this day's information, there are 1,387 political prisoners in the country. And I know that there are some initiatives that try to uncover how technically the Belarusian state becomes, in a way, the prison for the people within it. And one of such initiatives is a podcast that you can see via this QR code, and it just gradually tries to explain what's the difference between different detention centers, what's the difference between different sentences, and how the whole machine works right now. So I think this is what I wanted to talk about today. And this is the list of current political prisoners. And also, if you want to ask any questions or make any comments, you can do that. I allow. Yes, thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think we will have a stream open a bit for some questions, and then we can switch it off if people want to ask something on the record.
Yes.
And how is it inside of Belarusian prison? I mean, like, is it grassroots culture in prison? Is it red or is it black, or does it depend on something, or how is it in there inside?
There are reports. Well, so there is one thing, which is these detention centers for those who get short-term detentions. So in those people, if we talk about the physical conditions first, then those are quite drastic or bad, because there can be up to 40 people in one room or what can it be called, and a cell, and they don't get any of the things that they actually need to get. So for example, the mattresses or the blankets or anything like that they don't get. And if we talk about the grassroots atmosphere, as you named it, then the thing what some managers, well, the principals of the prisons or the colonies, what they do is that they collaborate with some of the prisoners and they try to provoke the political prisoners there. And if the political prisoners are provoked, that becomes a reason for them to be to get another to have their sentence being prolonged or to be put into stricter conditions. So for example, solitary confinement or things like that. And yeah, so I wouldn't. It's very difficult to assess because it also differs from one prison to another. And while of course all political prisoners try to support each other, and those could be of very different views, what we need to remember is that those are very different people. It's just technically a random sample of the whole country. They nevertheless try to be supportive of each other. But then if it comes to the kind of general atmosphere in the imprisonment places, then it's not really that easy to speculate about.
Okay, thank you.
Anything else? Yeah.
So is it that in Belarus schools are only in Russian?
Yeah, I didn't cover that. We still have 11 years of education. So we study Russian and Belarusian for 11 years, but just because there is no environment where everyone would speak Belarusian, so most of people just continue speaking Russian. B, parents speaking Russian. C, people not interested in learning Belarusian because, well, as I said before, it's sometimes considered as the countryside language. So before, in the youth, it was not really popular and people just neglected it. All of that just leads to the fact that even though people had learned it for 11 years, they cannot speak it. Yeah. For example, my brother cannot speak the language at all. Anything else? Yes?
Just a fun fact that Great Duchy of Lithuania,
Yeah.
as you mentioned before,
Yeah.
I'm from Russia, and from one region which is close to Belarus border.
Yeah.
And on our history lessons, it wasn't named like Great, what's it, Duchy? Of like Lithuania, but it was named Great Duchy of Lithuania and Russia.
Interesting. I think it was called, like, if you take the long name, it was something like the Great Duchy of Lithuania, Žemaitija, and something else like the Baltic lands, and of all Ruthenia, all Rus. So I guess maybe it comes from that, but I don't know. Yeah. If there are no other questions, then I guess that's it. Thank you for listening, and I will take my place.